Whenever I gaze upon the shores of Africa, the terror of the deepest, deadliest crimes rises before me. These lines by Hannah More were like a cry that shook the conscience of the 18th century. From the 15th century onward, Europe's horizons expanded. The light of the Renaissance, the thrill of exploration, and the hunger for conquest began reshaping the world. But this new world was not built solely on gold, spices, and discovery. It was also built on one of humanity's darkest shames, the slave trade. Europe's reach across Africa's coasts chained millions of people. The Atlantic Ocean became a graveyard of despair and greed. Today, I will take you through the story of this brutal trade, how slavery began, how it grew into a monstrous system, and how it eventually came to an end. If you are ready, let us open one of history's darkest chapters. The 15th century was a time of awakening for Europe. The Renaissance, which began in Italy, sparked a revolution in art, science, and ideas. In cities like Florence, Milan, and Pisa, this movement encouraged free thought and inquiry. Yet this enlightenment also gave rise to dangerous notions. The sparks of the Reformation, challenging religious authority, were slowly beginning to ignite. During this age of change, Europe's gaze turned to the seas. Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and other explorers set sail toward unknown lands, and suddenly, the world became a far larger place. Europe, however, was struggling with political and economic crises. The feudal order was crumbling, while wars and poverty shook the continent. This chaos drove European states to look overseas. Portugal, Spain, England, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark established colonies stretching from the Americas to Africa, from Asia to Australia. The New World promised fertile lands filled with gold, silver, sugarcane, and cotton. But to exploit these riches, a vast labor force was required. Migrants were too few, and the indigenous peoples were rapidly dying, stricken by harsh working conditions and diseases brought from Europe. The so-called indentured servitude system also failed to meet the demand. The solution was found in one of humanity's oldest and most brutal practices, slavery. Europe's ships turned toward the western coasts of Africa. Portugal was the first country to officially launch the African slave trade in 1441. Enslaved people were purchased and sold to work in the mines of Ghana. Between 1500 and 1535, around 10,000 slaves were traded. Spain also showed interest in this commerce, but the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 had left the African coasts under Portuguese control. As a result, the Spaniards usually obtained slaves through Seville or the Canary Islands, and from 1525 onward, they began transporting them from the island of São Tomé to Hispaniola in the Caribbean. In the 17th century, the Dutch expanded the trade from Senegal to Angola. England joined in through private companies, with London, Bristol, and especially Liverpool becoming central hubs of the slave trade. Between 1695 and 1807, some 5,300 ships sailed from Liverpool to Africa for the slave trade, compared to 3,100 from London and 2,200 from Bristol. From other European ports, only 450 ships set out. By the 1730s, Liverpool had seized leadership in the trade and maintained its dominance until the early 19th century. When the slave trade was abolished in 1807, Liverpool stood as the foremost centre of this shameful enterprise. This trade operated through a three-stage system infamously known as the triangular trade. The triangular slave trade was a vast network of exploitation linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The first stage was the export of goods from Europe to Africa. Ships departing from European ports carried weapons, ammunition, alcohol, textiles, and low-quality second-hand goods such as metalware. These items were often exchanged with local African kingdoms or tribal leaders. Many of these leaders supported the slave trade, selling their own people or war captives in exchange for profit. With the sale or barter of European goods, the first leg of the triangle was completed. The second stage, known as the Middle Passage, was the most brutal phase. Enslaved Africans were chained in the holds of ships and transported to the Americas or the Caribbean. Most were taken from slave markets along the West African coast, stretching from Senegal to Angola. Key centres included Senegambia, Upper Guinea, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, the Congo, and Angola. Local traders and armed raiding parties captured people from the interior, while others were seized as prisoners of war. A slave could be purchased on the African coast for as little as £3–4 sterling and sold in the Americas for £25–30. The third stage was the return voyage from the Americas to Europe. Ships sailed backloaded with raw materials such as sugar, rum, tobacco, timber, and cotton. In 18th century England, as it became fashionable among the wealthy to keep enslaved servants in their households, some ships occasionally carried enslaved people on this leg as well. When the ships finally reached European ports, the triangle was complete. This system brought wealth to Europe, devastation to Africa, and immeasurable suffering to the enslaved. The Middle Passage was the darkest face of the slave trade. Ships were specially designed to transport enslaved people, yet the conditions were horrific. In the 15th century, when the trade first began, the cargo holds of ships were set aside for only 20–30 captives. By the 17th century, larger vessels could carry as many as 400. The space allocated for each enslaved person was less than half a square meter, the size of a pillow. The height of the holds rarely exceeded half a meter, forcing people to endure the entire voyage lying down or crouching. With shackled feet, trapped in darkness and suffocating air, they struggled to survive in these conditions for weeks on end. Before boarding, captives were given a single meal, then chained and placed into the cargo hold. They were fed twice a day and monitored so that they did not become too weak. But storms or food shortages often disrupted this routine. The Middle Passage typically lasted around 45 days, but in stormy weather it could stretch to 2 months. When supplies ran low, rations were cut. In 1781, the captain of the ship Zong threw 136 enslaved people overboard, citing a shortage of food and water, just one of many examples of the trade's brutality. Women and children were transported in separate quarters, yet reports of sexual abuse by the crew were widespread. Upon arrival, enslaved Africans were forced to work in mines, plantations, construction, and domestic labor across the Americas and the Caribbean. About 40% were taken to the Caribbean, 38% to Brazil, 17% to Spanish America, and 6% to North America. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, around 11.7 million Africans were forcibly loaded onto ships. Only 9.7 million survived to reach the far shore of the Atlantic. 2 million lives were lost during the voyages, their names, stories, and dreams swallowed forever by the ocean's depths. In Europe, and especially in England, the slave trade was long regarded as something normal. Merchants such as Edward Colston and Foster Cunliffe were celebrated as philanthropic citizens. Statues were erected in their honor, and they were remembered for their charitable works. Yet by the late 18th century, this dark reality began to come to light. From the 1770s onward, the abolitionist movement in England gained momentum. Figures like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce led campaigns exposing the brutality of the slave trade. Moral, religious, and humanitarian arguments gradually won the support of the public. In 1807, both England and the United States abolished the slave trade. The Netherlands followed in 1814, France in 1815, and Spain in 1820. However, these bans applied only to the trade itself. The institution of slavery continued. It would take decades before enslaved people working on colonial plantations gained their freedom. In England, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was passed, though even this did not immediately guarantee full freedom for the enslaved. The end of slavery was not only a moral victory. Economic dynamics also played a crucial role. The Industrial Revolution created new opportunities across Europe. In 1790, Eli Whitney's cotton gin could process 50 times more cotton in a single day than one enslaved worker. With the advance of mechanization, the need for slave labor declined. Europe's bourgeoisie found new paths to wealth through industry and commerce. The slave trade was no longer profitable. When these economic changes converged with the abolitionist movement, the Atlantic slave trade came to an end in the 19th century. Yet this did not erase the scars of one of humanity's most brutal forms of exploitation. The Atlantic slave trade was unlike other systems of servitude. Millions of people were transported across the ocean and forced to work under inhumane conditions. For 3 centuries, this shameful enterprise impoverished Africa, enriched the Americas, and transformed Europe. Hannah More's lines capture the wound this shameful legacy left on the human conscience. The Atlantic slave trade was a mirror of humanity's greed and indifference. Yet at the same time, this dark era awakened the world's moral conscience. The abolitionist movements changed not only the laws, but also the very moral fabric of humanity. Today, telling this story is not merely about remembering the past, it is a call to shape the future. The cries of the enslaved still echo from the depths of the ocean, reminding us that we must work tirelessly for justice and humanity. History is not just a story, it is a lesson. What lesson will you choose to take from it? Stay tuned for more history, because every story is a part of our shared humanity.